Okay. All right. Looks like we're on. By we, I mean, good morning. If you hear us say hi, please, I'd love to feel you. I love to get a sense of your presence here. So, for this morning's, for this week's session for memetic literacy, I want to touch on some of the things that I was witnessing over the weekend for the whole business with Roe versus Wade. And it's a curious position because I'm Marcel. It's a and I'll say a few things about the flow that I'm noticing. A little context for anybody who's showing up new here. I do these weekly in order to, it's kind of a public service. It's one that I'm very happy to give. I enjoy talking about these things. I'm injecting a little bit of memetic literacy, a little bit of awareness of the nature of how thought structures actually move through culture and through the arc of history. Normally I end up talking a bit about long arcs of history and what the historical context is for why we think and feel the way we do. An example I've given a few times is the whole business of love conquers all, it's all about love, open your heart. That was actually a memetic mutation that appeared in the 1800s from the Romantic movement in response to the European Enlightenment. And that the reason it took that form was an intentional rejection of reason because of some intuitions about what the cult of reason was doing. But it couldn't quite articulate it and it couldn't argue on the basis of reason. So there's this significant split that appeared in sort of the memetic groundwater, the belief structure that forms culture. So the idea of love conquers all was not, it was not the thing 500 years ago. So knowing these things and understanding where they come from and what their response is to actually gives some context about why it is that we like the stories that we do. And right now, understanding the context of what part of history are we in right now, that's actually pretty relevant. I haven't gone into that in this series yet, but anyway, if you're new here, don't worry about it. I intend each of these, I keep using the term episodic, but I understand that's come to mean something a little bit different today. What I mean is you can watch each of these separately. You'll be fine. Okay. But all of these are uploaded to YouTube. I'm doing this live on Facebook for those who are viewing this on YouTube. But if you go to youtube.com/Morphenius, MORPHENIUS, you should be able to find that. Oh, hey, Brandon. Yes, you made it close to the beginning. Congratulations. It's nice to have you here. Okay. So normally, up to this point, I haven't talked about anything that's ongoing or current matters, but it was part of my intention to start bringing some of these up, and that's what I want to do here today. So the first thing I want to note is recent history in the sense of what's been going on in the last couple of days. So there's this big shakeup, 5 days ago. I want to show you something. I don't normally do screenshots, but I think this is important here. This is relevant context. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I'm going to show you a couple of snapshots of what the news is currently showing. I tend to do two sides, like one in the left eye and one in the right eye. So out of the right eye, we have something a little right wing here for Fox News. You look at the entire screen here. Where's the commentary on Roe versus Wade? Anything about the impact of it? So what you have is this narrative framing here. And they're talking about Dem-run cities, saying the left cities are all collapsing. 6 major cities on pace to pass historic 2021 violent crime totals halfway through 2022. It's a terrible phrasing, but they're saying the democratic cities are collapsing. That's the focus. There's stuff over here about the gas prices. And then if you scroll down, down here is the news on Roe versus Wade. It's overturned. All the way down here. Okay, so notice that. And then you pop over to CNN, which is about as left as Fox News is right, roughly speaking. And here you have more things on the gas prices. And then below that, it's not even the top thing. Here we're digging more into here's what's going on with Russia. Okay, and right here, you see something that's a little bit more about, oh, look, we're, like you notice this seems like information, but like notice the framing. US drugstore chains limiting purchases of emergency contraception in the wake of Roe versus Wade reversal. Okay. Now, I didn't even read the article. I don't really care that much. I wasn't trying to do a ton of research. I just want you to notice the narrative framing, including the structure of how these things appear just on the screen. Okay. So let me go back to being able to see y'all, see your comments. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you that is that there's something about, it's worth bearing in mind what the purpose is of news. Okay. There was a time period where there were constraints on what like when public programming was first coming out on television, there was some concern. There was a specific event, and I don't quite remember what it was off the top of my head, but there was a specific thing that showed up about the about an election being really swayed by what was on television. And so there was some sort of push put forward to say, okay, on the part of the government, there's a regulation. I think this might have been the founding of the FCC. I'm not quite sure. It's been a while since I reviewed this detail. But there was a shift that happened where there was a requirement that there be an educational component to what the various stations were providing. I forget exactly what the incentives were at the time, but the result was that like this was the birth of not the birth of, but it was like a flourishing of journalism. Like this showed up in newspapers, but also on television news programs, and this is part of how the journalism in television news programs really took off. I remember, this is actually about World War II propaganda. There were problems with World War II propaganda messing with people's sense of what was really going on. And the government correctly noticed this as a concern and passed some legislation to try to adjust it. So there was a period of time where the reason for news channels, they did not get profit based on views. The profit angle came from they were fulfilling a requirement, and part of fulfilling the requirement meant that they were producing accurate information in as neutral a form, as educational a form as possible. At some point when profit came into the picture, it became much more important for news places to attract views. As soon as you have an incentive structure like that, that's where like what bleeds leads. That whole thing was already there for newspapers. This is the cause of the Spanish-American War. It was some newspaper company deciding that a war sold newspapers, and so they created a war. So it's worth bearing in mind that that's the kind of structure you're dealing with when you're looking at news today. Its purpose is twofold. One is seeking out a way to get people to view it, which can, we know about the whole what bleeds leads thing. I think that phrase is dying out, that people are generally aware of this today, that news sources like to create a kind of worriness. At least when I say people are generally aware of this, what I mean is that in my circles, people who listen to me, generally seem to know this. Right? I don't know how much mainstream this is, and it definitely can't be mainstream in the media, because those are the people we're talking about. Those are the structures we're talking about. But it's worth bearing in mind that it's not just about what creates alarm. There's a huge amount. There's a huge technical industry pushed forward by the likes of Facebook and Google and Amazon. We've developed the tech, particularly over the last 10-ish years, to be really, really good at doing things like A/B testing to see. I know I won't go into technical details, but I'm saying there are structures that they do in order to automate the process of checking what things will cause people to keep checking the news, keep checking their news. They do these checks, and they're machine learning processes that are explicitly designed to hack the human motivational system, primarily by keeping you reactive and then seeing how do you react, what can we offer you. So this is one of the reasons why you find news cycles dying out so quickly. It's a little strange if you sort of step back and you look at the bigger picture. A lot of people, like I tend to have left-leaning folk clustered around me. I don't know if I know anybody personally who would describe themselves as pro-life. So like account for that in terms of what kind of information bubble I have. So so because of that clustering, like what I saw was vast devastation on Friday. Lots of people feeling gutted and like a little disoriented. You see William Matheson saying, I used to read Heartist. Does that count? I don't know what that is. Sorry, I can't comment on that. Heartiste, I imagine that's how it's pronounced. Heartiste. Anyway, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of it. So I assume it's a news place. Some people, like I know some people say, oh, I get around this by reading The Economist, or oh, I get around this by listening to NPR. Okay. The thing to bear in mind is that the structures that result in you having access to media have some motivational structure. If you don't know what that motivational structure is, then you are accepting programming without knowing the intent of the programmer. Like I have a little bit of charge about this, but it's also just a fact. It's something to be aware of. If you don't know why the information is being handed to you, if you don't know why the information is being produced, if you only have stories in your head and you haven't looked to see what are the things that if they were to change, it would result in the information not landing in my lap anymore. What are those forces? If you don't know what those are, then you are blindly trusting things that you're not paying attention to. So it's worth noticing that. I have some things I want to say about the Roe versus Wade stuff, but I see there's another comment here. Brandon says, I don't know where you are going with this, but I have a hope that the work being done to hijack our attention will actually help humans learn a new way of interfacing that makes them more immune to such hijackers. Yeah, me too. I hope people are getting dizzy. They're noticing, this sucks. Let's not do this. And I see a lot of hope for that. I've been, throughout the pandemic, I was chanting, all information is crap. Obviously, I don't mean that literally, but it's a helpful thing to notice and to know. And I am grateful to see that people are starting to pick this up in their own language, in their own ways, noticing, the information diet I'm receiving is not to be taken blindly. Great. So I want to name a few things that I saw. Oh, so one thing, let me finish wrapping up what I was saying there. And then I want to go on to some of the specific memetic moves that I witnessed over the last few days. So on net, I think it's really interesting to notice that Despite the fact that in my information bubble, lots and lots of people were devastated Friday and Saturday over the Roe versus Wade stuff. Now it's hard to find anything. No one's really talking about it. No one's, it's not on the news. I make a point of not logging into news things, and sometimes I'll switch to incognito just to make sure it's not doing a tracking thing, and I'll even add in some VPN stuff just so I can see, okay, to the best of my ability, what do you tell a generic viewer? And 5 days later, all there is on the left-leaning site one little note trying to stir up a frame, like that thing about emergency contraceptive, like the Plan B stuff being withdrawn. Like I didn't look into it, but I could easily imagine that what's going on there is not an attack on women's reproductive rights, but rather that the industry wasn't actually prepared to deal with the increase in demand. And so there is a need to be a little more careful, so that it's like, because if you just sold it first come first serve, you suddenly are out, and first come first serve may not be the method that they want to do. I don't know why, but I could imagine there being some good reasons, like people who didn't think things through very carefully with their partner and aren't taking careful responsibility for their current situation. I'm not assigning blame, I'm just noticing that situation is very different from somebody getting raped. And if there's a distinction to be made between these, it seems like you very clearly want emergency contraceptive to be, if you have to choose, it seems much more clear that you would want to give the latter easier opportunity to access the emergency contraceptives. Now, I don't know if that's what was behind that headline, but the headline implied that something that is already at risk is now like, oh God, this is being taken away. Like all of my reproductive rights options are being taken away. Oh no. Okay, it's not a coincidence that that's on the left-leaning paper, on left-leaning news. Okay, but that's it. This is a little bit of stir, and it's not the biggest one. 5 days later, collective memory has become immensely short. The shorter your memory is, like if you have Alzheimer's and you cannot remember more than a few minutes, you cannot change your behavior to account for the patterns that are longer than a few minutes that you participate in that create difficulty for you. If you could not remember more than one day, then any pattern that lasts a couple of days or a week or months or years, you wouldn't be able to orient to. Lucidity with respect to memory is what gives you the vision to be able to consciously orient to the patterns that govern your life and have you caught in Groundhog's Day loops. If it's Groundhog's Week or Groundhog's Year or Groundhog's Decade or Groundhog's Generation, your memory has to be that long for you to notice how you participate in those patterns. That's the actual thing I care about when I talk about history. It's not about knowing these facts. It's about nudging collective memory to be long enough to deal with larger patterns. If collective memory can't last even a week, and if there is any kind of force that has a cycle that lasts more than a week, say an election cycle, then the population is extremely guidable and controllable. Now I don't mean to necessarily say that there is a conspiracy here. It would be a little strange if there weren't people who were intentionally using an awareness of memetics in order to manipulate the populace. It would be very weird if that weren't the case. But I also think that most of the things that people attribute to conspiracies are much more easily explained by a clear understanding of how memetic evolution works and how memes work at all. So I see Brandon saying, I saw some posts going around with people suggesting hoarding things like Plan B. Yeah. There's a Perry Chase makes this point that I may butcher her point, so this is my version of her point. Bear that in mind. About that one of the things that the overturning of Roe versus Wade actually highlights is the way in which people in general and women in particular have not been taking personal responsibility for their own reproduction. They've been turning to the government to protect their reproductive rights. I'm framing this in a left-leaning way. You could do this in a right-leaning way and highlight they've been turning to the government in order to control all of this horrible child murder that's going on, and saying the government has to save us from this. It's much more obvious what's wrong with that reasoning if you look on the left-leaning side. Because like what the left wants is a transformation in culture such that they don't have to take responsibility for their own reproductive rights. Not for reproductive rights is not what I mean, for their own pregnancy, their own process of getting pregnant and relating to that, because they think they shouldn't have to. So there's a couple of reasoning things that I want to walk through here related to the memetic patterns that I've observed over the last couple of days. So on, I believe it was either Friday evening or Saturday, I saw a tweet from somebody saying, and I wish I could find it. I would have pulled it up and shown you. And it went by my feed and then vanished very quickly. But it had thousands of likes and views and shares. Some woman saying something like, so let me get this straight. I'm going to be forced to bring a child to term, but I'm not given decent maternity leave or parental support in order to help raise that child in a good circumstance. So a couple of things, I want to highlight two elements here. The first is that that's actually not what the overturning of Roe versus Wade does. What overturning Roe versus Wade did was it made it so that states were allowed to ban abortion if the states choose. Right? Roe versus Wade had blocked that previously. So you had weird get-arounds that states like Texas did sometime last year. I forget exactly what it was. So I seriously doubt that California is ever going to ban abortions. That's just not going to happen. I bet if there were a national ban on abortions, California would still legalize it in effect, kind of like what happened with marijuana. Right? So this is like the issue is not that everyone is being forced, all women are being forced to carry children to term. I mean, for one thing, there's something to be said about what about the personal responsibility of tracking when you're having sex, how you navigate that. And I know it shouldn't be that way. It's okay, that's fine. You can add all the shouldn'ts you want to, but there's a fact of what you are in fact capable of affecting and what you are not. So in this circumstance, you're not being forced to take a child to term. You're being forced to deal with the consequences of a larger legal system. You can think that's unfair, but what's the energy behind that? Just track the energy behind it. Where does the energy come from? Why are you so upset about it? I doubt that the woman who was posting that tweet was pregnant with a pregnancy she didn't want. Right, so this was a hypothetical that was stirred specifically in order to create alarm. So this is the second thing that I want to highlight here, which requires that first bit. So the first bit is that there's a piece of logic missing, which is that Roe versus Wade does not ban abortions. It does not even lead to a universal ban on abortions. What it does is it makes it something that is up to each state. But importantly, the framing as though the overturning of Roe versus Wade creates this wave of banning abortions, and which may very well happen. There may be a bunch of states that go woohoo and then jump on the bandwagon. Maybe they already have. I don't keep careful tabs on this anymore because in an important way, it doesn't matter. This is at the end of a causal chain. It's not the cause of anything. So the question is, what causes the extreme framing? Why did that tweet get so much attention and so much forwarding? It's not a new argument. It's the same thing that was there before. There's an illusory fear here. So what is so interesting about that distortion? And it is a distortion. Absolutely is. Maybe you could come up with an argument that, oh, this will lead to like bigger battles over something that we thought we had already won. And why is it interesting for so many people? Why do so many people find it so interesting to devour a rotten frame, a twisted frame that makes things seem much worse than they actually are? There's another piece that I saw of someone who had posted, this was in a comment on Instagram. And when I pushed back, she went, oh, yeah, that's what I meant. I'm sorry, I just wasn't thinking very carefully about how I was phrasing it. I was typing quickly on my phone. So I'm going to acknowledge her on that. But what she had said was something like, we need to build a separate culture. So there's no fixing this one. I'm just like clearly referring to the US. All of this is US centric because like the US is the one that cares about this right now. This is where the center of all the culture wars are because the US is the center of power in the world. So this is where all of the battles over the minds of everybody needs to happen. I mean, more so than in other places for the most part, with exceptions, because memetics is complicated. And then she had said something like, we need to build a separate culture because we can't fix this one. It's too corrupt. Its corruption is too fundamental. And you know, there's a way in which I basically agree. I don't think that we shift cultural platforms and then let the other one just die. I suspect that there's a place to stand and orient to what pieces we can salvage. But details aside, but the specific thing I wanted to highlight is that she said, we need this separate culture to be women-led and heart-centered. I pushed back on this saying, hey, I don't think that's quite what you mean. What I think you mean is, because if you aim for women-led and heart-centered, you won't get what you're thinking of. You won't get what you're hoping for. You'll get just a different version of the same thing, maybe with a different veneer, but that's about it. You know, what I think she was looking for is something more like a more yin-led, more feminine-led, but with like capital F, so energetic principles rather than femininity-led. Okay. And like she said, oh yeah, that's what I meant. But the thing to ask here, the thing to track is, why was that a slip up that was even possible? You will never hear me slip up that way. Or maybe my mouth will trip for a moment, but I'm not going, but even then, I'm not going to accidentally say women when I mean feminine. or when I mean yin, to be clear. I'm not going to say women when I mean yin. That's just never going to happen. Because I have clarity about what I'm talking about. I'm not mixing them. So there's a whole memetic thread here that's part of the, it's part of feminism having gotten warped, gotten seriously warped. I have my own rants about this. There's a kind of casual hatred and dismissal of men that is now part of the culture that we still don't have room to talk about. It still is. It still makes you anti-feminist or misogynist or something like that to talk about this. I don't want to overwhelm this particular discussion and conversation by going too much into that. Although if y'all are super interested and you have questions about it, I can touch on it a little bit more. But like, just to give you a quick snapshot of what I'm talking about, this is stuff like this includes in French culture, interestingly enough. I found this out when I went to France. I'm like, oh, this is a thing here. It's fine to have this attitude of, oh man, like the men would starve, they're incompetent, they can't do anything right. They like you don't want to leave them to take care of the kids. They might kill the kids, not like because they're monsters that are gonna like kill them in rage, but like they're just gonna feed them. God, they might feed them just toxic junk, and not take care of them in the ways that are really essential, and they can't do basic stuff like. But that's okay. We still find them endearing. We women will take care of the men anyway. It's fine to have that kind of narrative. There are a lot of sitcoms that are based on that kind of narrative. But if you were to flip it, everyone goes berserk. Oh, these poor girls, they can't do anything. We men need to take care of them. We need to protect them because like women are so incompetent or women are so frail. That's just absolutely unforgivable today. But it's okay in the other direction. So there's something there that is there's a meta pattern that is not being tracked at a cultural level, and it's from a pendulum swing. So seeing these patterns, seeing these meta structures showing up, this is part of where the memetic confusion is showing up. This is where so when you see when people start, I bet as we get closer to the midterm elections in the United States, we're going to see more and more of this ramping up. This is part of what I said when I said, hey, things are going to get a little crazier pretty soon. I was a little surprised to see the stuff on Roe versus Wade in the aftermath of that dying out so quickly. I sort of suspect it's going to get revved up again in 2-ish months. I'm not great at specific timing like that, but you know, it needs to spike in order to rally. It really needs to. So 2-3-ish months, I'm guessing. You're going to see a huge influx of stuff. And between now and then, you can expect there to be a little bit of, I'm trying to, how to describe this. Like meat tenderizing, but like subtle. Marination. I think marination might be a good metaphor. Memetic marination. There'll be these little hints, these little pokes, like that Plan B thing I showed, which is different from saying they're lying. What I mean is, what is causing? Like there are two forces that are going to show that show up in terms of what appears in the news. One is just this raw thing of what creates clicks, what's profitable. But the other thing is, as I mentioned before, it's excruciatingly unlikely that there aren't people with relevant political power who know something about memetics and use it in order to better their position within politics. This is where you get the real conspiracy stuff. So like it's extremely unlikely that anybody has enough memetic control to decide to create this culture war and stir it with these specific movements. I don't think anybody has that amount of control. I don't think there's an Illuminati that's doing the whole thing. But it seems highly likely that there are people stirring the pot and are intentionally pushing for certain narratives to appear. This is along the lines of when you hear people chanting about MK Ultra, all of that, you know, like, okay, so stuff like that does happen. Stuff like that absolutely does happen. I believe there's a whole memetics branch. I don't know what they call it, but there's basically a memetics branch inside of the CIA. And they've been studying this stuff for decades. It's basically souped up propaganda. So yes, clearly, there is intelligent effort to manipulate the minds and beliefs of the population. That doesn't mean it's one-sided, but it's absolutely there. The real war, the real world war we're in is memetic. And it shows up in meaningful ways, like China and Russia and Europe and the United States. Like everybody's at war. Less so like the Western countries. The Western countries aren't actively at war with each other as much. But there's a reasonable bit there. So the news cycle you're going to watch over the next couple of months, particularly if you are in the US, or if you're watching the US from the outside. If you're watching the US from the outside, you're not the target. But if you are a US citizen, and if you are in the United States, you're going to encounter this stuff a lot. There are going to be these little hints and gestures that kind of tug on your psyche based on what position you've been sort of machine learning determined to be in, and sort of positioning you in a particular way. And then there will be an explosion sometime in the next couple of months where there's going to be, if it's not the Roe versus Wade stuff being stirred up again, it will be a new issue because they have to find something. They've got to find something in order to stir reactivity. In martial arts, we would teach that you need to use a temi in order to throw somebody. So my martial art, I trained in Aikido Jiu-Jitsu, but you can think of it as Aikido, throwing-based martial art. But the first thing you've got to do to make it practical is as soon as you are dealing with the person, you like finger slap to the face or you punch in the gut. And the idea of this is not to damage them. Aikido is a very gentle martial art in that the goal is never to harm the attacker. It is to disable them. Instead, the point is, bam, if I shock you, then I can move you because you're too busy dealing with the fact that something just slapped your face. Too busy for a fraction of a second. But if I can get a startle response, right, then bam, boom, I can use my knowledge of how the body responds, my trained embodied knowing of how your body responds to a finger slap to the face and then direct your momentum. Okay. This is the same thing. It's just at a memetic level. Something shocking. He said that. Ooh, we need to go protest. No, you don't. You really don't. If there's an obvious next step for you to do, the chances are extremely good that that's what you're being funneled into doing. So the thing to notice is, first off, where are you feeling more inclined to grab onto the news? To go, what's going on? What's going on? When you feel that urgency, if it's not about something that is immediately important for your physical survival or your ability to function in what you are doing right now in your physical environment. And I mean on the level of, can you go to the grocery store and buy food? You don't need to know what the inflation rates are. You don't need to know how bad inflation is, because if you need to go buy food, you're going to go buy food. You'll find out what the prices are. Maybe you need to look them up ahead of time in order to see, hey, do I need to change my plan about what I'm getting at the grocery store? Maybe I want to do that before I go. But that's a personal choice about how you want to navigate it. The thing with Roe versus Wade, you have no power over. You now know it's been overturned. The thing that's going to be relevant for you is if you are at all plausibly in a situation where you might end up entangled with an unwanted pregnancy, you might want to keep tabs on how abortion laws are changing. That's it. You don't need to know every day. Okay? You don't need to find out what this politician said about what, like, how are we going to push this into federal law? Like, that's not important. It's not relevant for you. This is part of how the whole, in this case, I'm focusing on the national scale rather than the global scale. It's a good case study to zoom in on how do the memetic dark arts actually work. In one large chunk of how they work is they keep you distracted from clear vision of what is yours to respond to, what you are actually responsible for, what you are able to respond to, versus what is part of the context that is helpful to know, but only after you have your center. One of the tricks of the dark arts is to blur those two and convince you that there is no relevant difference. And then to say, to the extent that there is a difference, if you can tell the difference, then your priority needs to be on the larger context. This is part of how activists are encouraged to think and be, is to go out and go stand on the street corner and shake my sign. Here's the thing: if you're standing on a street corner shaking your sign with a bunch of other people doing the same, the chances are extremely good that you're in a culture, in a local culture area that already agrees with your sign. Like, seeing all of these people, like, the area I live in is left-leaning. It's become more left-leaning over the last couple of decades, but this is near Seattle. Okay? And when I go to the downtown here, this is Olympia, which is like the capital for Washington State. When I go to downtown and I see people saying support Ukraine and Roe versus Wade, unfair, like saying it's unfair to have overturned Roe versus Wade. Like, okay, guys, whom are you talking to? There's a group of like 20 people who are doing this. Whom are you talking to? There's a sharp clarity that's available here. I think that it's important to cultivate that clarity for yourself and to notice in particular when your body is getting alarmed by what's going on, and then you go into your mind trying to sort out what's going on. That's the core basic defensive movement against most memetic dark arts. Brandon says, uh-oh, you mean when I talk, I should be talking to someone else? Well, I mean, if you can, sometimes like there's only you. It's a world of you. To be a little more precise, what I mean is to be aware of why you're speaking. What is the intent of the speech? What a lot of people involved in activism are actually seeking is a feeling of meaningfulness, like they're doing something about a cause. But the cause has been handed to them, as has the method of fighting for it. So many of them, I think maybe most of them, I'm not sure, I haven't done anything like a survey, but it's outside of effective altruism, it's pretty overwhelming to me how much research activists don't do. When what they call research seems to be more a matter of consuming propaganda for one specific side of an issue. And bear in mind, most of my exposure to activism was in Berkeley. Maybe this is part of Berkeley culture, but I see the same thing around here. I've seen it when I read things online, spread all over the place. You know, it's definitely a trend. There's a trend here, where the actual purpose of activism is to, well, the purpose on the individual scale, the reason many activists get involved is because it gives them this feeling like they can contribute to something. And it's that feeling that is the thing that they're looking for. Which, yeah, it's entangled with, well, I want to actually be doing good. I don't mean to dismiss that part. But the question of why this cause? If the answer is mental, really fast, then you haven't made this distinction between what you are actually responsible for and what you can be aware of, but you are not responsible for on a larger scale. That's the main confusion. It doesn't matter how important the grand scale thing is. If there's a meteor heading for Earth and it's going to destroy all life on Earth in the next 7 years, like in about 7 years from now, it's going to land and destroy us all. You can't do anything about that. That doesn't mean it is a good idea to ignore it and just plan on dying in 7 years. But if you can't get clear about the fact that you personally do not have the power to stop that meteor, you personally do not have the power to make culture shift so that it will take that meteor seriously. If you can't get clear about that, then what happens instead is that you lend your consciousness to whatever memetic force tries to grab the entire population. And if you're lucky, a lot of people doing that will result in a reactivity that will deal with the meteor, sending a nuke to blow it up or something. I don't really know how this works, but okay, maybe we can do something about it. But if it's based on reactivity, that means that no one is actually taking responsibility, which means that the larger memetic forces, the egregores, the consciousnesses that are made of individuals lending their life force energy to this bigger thing. You don't need to go mystical. You don't need to believe in some sort of ephemeral energy. I'm talking about in the way that Black Lives Matter is a movement. What is a movement? It's a type of egregore. It's a type of creature. It has a survival instinct. It has desires, and no one's driving it. People are contributing to it. They act as the mouthpieces for it, to the extent that they are possessed by that egregore. I'm not trying to dismiss anything about it. I'm describing the mechanisms. So if you have a culture that can only do things via possession, then the way that you lend power to, well, I mean, you can either lend your power or not. You can't actually control what the thing does on a larger scale. So getting really clear about that is immensely important, and it is exactly what the memetic environment we are in tries to scramble. It's exactly what it's trying to scramble. So if you're listening to me and you're going, oh, this guy's nuts about this, well, I mean, where's the reactivity coming from? Although I think a lot of the people who like to listen to me right now kind of already know this. It just seems worth pounding a little bit. I want to point in a direction of, this is one last bit about compassion, highlighting an element of the argument that goes back and forth with the abortion stuff in the United States. There's an element here that doesn't make sense, that if you see it clearly, then you can actually contribute to a solution. You don't have control over whether a solution manifests, but if you can see it clearly and embody a solution in this direction, then I think you can lend your being to a more conscious, compassionate resolution of this, at least this facet of the culture war, and the culture wars in general. Not that it's up to you. The reason to do it is because I think it brings a lot of peace and clarity, and it makes you more immune to being hijacked as this memetic war, as this part of the global memetic war really heats up. Learning to be fully immune to these things by standing in your own clarity is absolutely essential, because to the extent that you don't, you will be possessed and you will be guided, and you will believe it is because of the choices that it will be because you believe in these causes. Brandon says, you're just talking to people that already agree with you, but you're trying to clarify what is going on rather than shutting down peace and clarity. Yeah, I have two ways of reading what you mean. I'm not sure if the "you're" there is about me in particular, or if you mean when one is talking to people that already agree with you, you can do it in this way. I'm guessing you mean me in particular. And I'm not trying to just talk to people that already agree with me. I'm actually just saying what I see. And I'm trying to encourage peace and clarity. Yes, me, okay. I'm trying to encourage peace and clarity. One result of this is that as a matter of personal integrity, I make a point of avoiding hooking people by their reactivity. I don't try to do this I don't try to manipulate away from hooking. I'm just like, I'm just not going to engage in hooking. And this means that what I'm saying and how I'm saying it is not going to be as exciting as people who are brandishing warpath signals. We've got to fight for women's reproductive rights or anything. Brandon says, I am stating something I see, but I'm also playfully poking at you regarding your comments on protests. Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's worth highlighting a difference there. Like, I know you're trying to be playful here and to point out some element, like the way that you're being playful, I imagine, is an attempt to poke at a point of hypocrisy. I claim this is not, there is no hypocrisy in what I'm doing here. If there were a platform by which I could speak clearly to people who disagree with me as well, then I would take that. I would be happy to. I would say many of the same things. It would be, I would prefer to have more room for something like dialogue, but I'm not interested in arguing. The difference is that there is a I'm not trying to conquer minds. The thing that the protesters are doing is, yeah, William's mentioning Michael's not protesting at us. Yeah, the thing that the protesters are doing is largely about loudly signaling a tribal allegiance and creating this feeling of belonging by being part of that. You didn't intend to imply hypocrisy. Okay, and I'm not quite sure what the energy is behind the behind the playfulness. I know that you're a playful character, and I know we often have our kind of a curious way that we misstep in our communications with each other. I still haven't really understood the exact nature of that one. I believe you. I want to finish saying what I'm saying here, just for the sake of anybody else who is watching or will watch this later. For me, it is very important that what I am putting forward is not a matter of conquering minds. It's not a matter of aligning with people who already agree with me and saying, we agree with each other. Well, the reason, if people follow the kind of direction that I would hope they do, is the kind of direction that I try to go into, we'll end up on the same side. But the reason is because we're aligned with the truth. So that to me is a very important distinction, even if it results in most of the people who listen to me already agree, because I'm not hooking people by their reactivity in order to get attention. Jean Znadarsik, I've often wondered how to say your name. I sometimes say it in my head. And Jean Snadarsic says, I exist on a pile of bones of my ancestors who suffered terribly because they were enslaved for reproductive use by the church. So I always have to spend a lot of my energy in recentering myself as these cultural upheavals unfold. Yeah, this brings up an important dimension of this, which is that a lot of our reactivity is not just because of what is currently happening, but because of the history, both, oh, good. I'm glad I got the pronunciation right. It's not just because of what's currently going on in current politics, but because of a lot of the momentum of the past, and which includes some things that seem to get into our genetics. It's not entirely clear how much trauma is or is not in genetics. There's some pretty clear evidence that it at least shows up at the epigenetic level over a couple of generations, depending on what the trauma structure is. And it's unclear whether whether longer or more intense traumas last more generations. Science doesn't know, but I think that regardless of whether it's biological or memetic, it's very clear that there's a momentum from the past, like you're talking about. And that's part of the context, and it's part of why the thing about the verbal slip up of women-led instead of yin-led, part of the reason that appears is because of a sort of reactivity of like, it's not just, hey, let's bring in a future of freedom, peace, harmony. Not harmony like just some abstract thing, but the harmony that actually works, harmony with teeth. Right? They bring in something that actually works. It's not just that. It's a fuck you boundary. How dare this happen? Yeah, like we're gonna take, like, women's liberation has this tone of going to war. The thing about the culture war, we have to fight for our rights. We have, like, I mean, that energy can never resolve without the complete destruction of the enemy. And unsurprisingly, you find that the enemy does not want to be completely obliterated. Like, if you look at the current way that the abortion thing is going, what would a resolution look like? It depends on whom you're talking to, because both sides seem to have this tone of, well, a resolution would be, we win and obliterate the existence of the opposing culture. Memetic murder, like that's what we're talking about. Memicide, I guess it would be. They want full on memicide. It's not like genocide, but for memes. Yeah, Brandon's mentioning, I was adopted the day I was born. When I met my biological mother as an adult, we found out we had a lot of similar struggles in our lives. Yeah. Twin studies are fascinating along these lines too. So anyway, I want to come back to this piece of the compassion. So like this element that I'm describing of what would resolution look like. Both sides are saying complete memicide of the other side, and then unsurprisingly, because both of the memetic sides have something equivalent to a survival instinct, there can't be a resolution unless the resolution is unless the resolution is some side gets a decisive, an overwhelmingly decisive memetic edge. We're talking about an overwhelmingly decisive edge that is stronger than what the Nazis got in Germany for World War II. It would have to be much more overwhelming than that, because there was still resistance to the Nazis in Germany in World War II. You would need something that was complete and utter memetic victory of one side over the other in order to result in a true resolution of the abortion issue. This is like a case study. We do the same thing with guns. We can do the same thing with some of the stuff with climate change. We can, I mean, it has nothing to do with the topic. This is a common structure. So, see, Jean mentions, in my case, the suffering was shared by both/all genders. I see how men are exactly as wretched when the goddess is dreaded and loathed. Yeah, this is, there's an element here that I could spend a long time going into. The way this often gets phrased is something like, the patriarchy hurts men too. I think that is completely correct. And the patriarchy is misnamed. It's not about patriarchy. It's about something called Goodhart's Law, which is also terribly named. But the problematic structure is not that men rule. This is where the whole thing about, oh, revere the goddess so women should lead. I mean yen, but women. It's deeper than that. It's the same thing lives in the minds and bodies of women as well. The problem is something more like believing in the world of form as the foundation of causation, and therefore trying to manipulate the physical world and the words that are said in the physical world in order to create the change that you want to see, by literally trying to make it be that way instead of dealing with the energetic patterns that are a few steps earlier. I mean something very precise by this, something that if I wanted to spend extra energy into, I could totally fit in a materialist paradigm. I don't want to take that time right now. Anyway, the short version is I agree, except for maybe some language shift. William replies to Jean mentioning, indeed, that's a source of meaning beyond authoritarian control, so we can't have that. Yeah, it's, yeah. At some point, I may give another go at trying to explain some things about so it's something I learned specifically from David Deutsch about two kinds of memetic evolution, or two convergent styles of memetic evolution, which results in basically two species of egregore. And the currently dominant species of egregore propagates via not so much about authoritarian control, but definitely keeping people confused and keeping them stunned and traumatized. There's another one, which is more based on clarity, and that's part of what's going on is if the competition between these two species can run over time long enough, the other one will win out, guaranteed, because its power is based in truth and reality. And it's just a more stable foundation to move from. An example of this is the way that science overwhelmed the capacity of the church to be able to affect the world. So there's a general trend like that. There's concern about whether the memetic war will destroy the ability for the memetic competition to continue, because if you end up with global civilizational collapse, then the communication between different parts of the world drops dramatically, and then memetic evolution slows down, and then you can end up with isolated pockets of memetic evolution happening. Over sufficiently long periods of time, the memes of clarity will win out, basically guaranteed. Jean mentions, well, truth and reality have won already. Kind of, we're getting there. They always win in some fundamental sense. But you still have, like, for instance, right now, I still cannot cross into Canada because I have not gotten the COVID vaccine. My parents have, and they can head up there. But this law is still in place. I'm like, okay, like what's the reasoning behind that? And we can go through the logic, we can trace it, but it's not because of a careful consideration of how important it is to make sure that this ban is in place. It's because of the kind of political momentum. So that kind of thing, I think, is really important to track. But in an important way, I think we basically, there's a foundational way in which I suspect we agree. Brandon mentions, if memes are life forms that evolve, they could potentially evolve to support each other rather than struggle for survival at the expense of the other. Yes, and they do tend, she mentions reality RS. So memes do tend to do this. Egregoric structures do tend to converge and support each other. An example, there are a couple of examples of this. On the horrendous side, there is advertising. Advertising methods have been converging and mutually supporting, even though the basis, like, you have things like there isn't a whole, there's basically no competition. Like there's close to no competition between places that want to sell cars and places that want to sell you diet plans. The only possible exception is that if somebody is so tight on their budget that they have to choose between buying a car or going for a diet plan, they sort of need to choose between them. There's a little bit of competition in that sense, but not enough to really matter. Okay. But they do end up helping each other unconsciously on the part of basically everybody involved. But there's an effect here where the basic way of selling anything is to hook people by their sense of inadequacy, and then imply that they can resolve the inadequacy by buying their product. So on the part of cars, there's this sense of freedom. Why? Because you don't have freedom. You need to purchase your freedom. Or sexiness, attraction, having a fun time with friends. You can't get these things on your own right now, so maybe what you need is a new car. Or with the diet plans, your health is off, and don't you want to be able to keep up with your kids or your grandkids? And don't you want to be around for them? And life is so much better when you're, or if you want to attract a mate, maybe nobody likes you because you're fat. This kind of thing, like it hooks. Like they'll often be more subtle about the messaging and add a bit of humor to sort of distract from the core point. The core point being, there's something wrong with you and you know it. But if you buy our product, we can help resolve that. So what you can get, a place where car sales places and diet plan sales places will converge, is encouraging you to believe in and react to your sense of inadequacy. So you end up with a convergent evolutionary force where most advertisements agree with conveying a coherent message. I mean, not a coherent is kind of a funny way to say it, but a relentless sort of a DDoS attack, if you're familiar with the term, distributed denial of service attack. You end up with a DDoS attack on your own sense of self-permission and adequacy. That gets attacked from a whole bunch of different angles, not because anybody planned it, but because it's of advantage to all these different advertisers. So that's an example of where you have seen, and you can watch the style of advertisement. Style today is different from 20 years ago. You can watch the style shift. The style shifts coherently because there is a sort of cooperative effort on the part of a lot of these unconscious forces. So it's a long-winded way of saying, yep, I agree, that happens. Let's see, Brandon says, I think the negativity you may have picked up from what I said earlier came from some sadness I have over difficulty with conversing with people that think differently, since people tend to cluster around people that think like them. Even though you may want to talk to different people, I imagine that would be hard for you to actually do, and I feel that. Yeah. The fact that there can be, yeah, I feel a lot of the sadness there too. Yeah, oh my God, too, somebody else just liked it. Yeah. The fact that disagreement can be a reason to not even listen is, it's very sad. And it's part of the cause of the pain that we're in collectively, part of what we're dealing with. And William responds to Brandon's comment saying that this is also kind of a negative topic to begin with, or rather the impetus is negative. Yeah, talking about some of the negative side of memes. Brandon adds in, I was hoping for a response regarding evolution that would also include it not being at our expense. Okay, so an example of that is the creation of Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equations was actually a synthesis of a whole bunch of different material from earlier researchers who were trying to understand the way that electricity works and the way that magnetism works, and discovering that there's an interrelationship between them, and there were a bunch of principles explored. And the combining of all of these into Maxwell's equations was a massive cooperative effort that it was a little bit like the difference between cooperation and breeding, like memetic merger, like genetic merger, at the level of means is not very clear. This is sort of like the primordial soup where you have strands of RNA or DNA sort of floating around and then they sometimes combine. Like, what's that? Do you want to call that sexual reproduction? I mean, I guess technically it's what turned into sexual reproduction. This is complicated. But if you see what it is, then like I think this is a fine example of that. I also think that a lot of the consciousness raising stuff that happens, not just, hey, we need to raise consciousness about the issues with women's reproductive rights. Like that's more of the rivalrous dynamics thing. But I mean the actual raising of consciousness, like the type of thing that I'm encouraging here. How did I come to a position where this is something that I can even want to encourage? And it's something that I speak about in public. It's not because I invented all this stuff. It's because I am a recipient of the process of evolution that is encouraging the collective human race to become more sentient. A lot of stuff about trauma processing has become particularly popular over the last 15-ish years. That is an example of something burbling up in support of all of this work. So there's a whole, like the ones that are pro-clarity and are about pro-truth tend to have a much easier time cooperating with each other because they're talking about the same thing. They just naturally merge. So there are a few examples that I hope are nice. Anyway, so I enjoy engaging with y'all. I want to touch on the thing that I kept meaning to touch on before. There's a couple of bits of logic, particularly with the abortion stuff, that I think is worth tracking and noticing. So there's when you look at the question of what would a resolution actually look like, there's a thing that I often hear from the left that and not often, but I've encountered it every now and then that I found clarifying, which pointed out that the argument structure of pro-life doesn't actually seem to be about children. It seems to be about punishing women for having sex. There's a couple of points in the reasoning that they highlight here. One is there is not an equivalent amount of energy behind supporting women who are pregnant with having enough nutrition, enough natal care, with them making sure that they have the resources they need to raise the kid or to make sure that there is something appropriately kind for the foster child system, for the foster care system. So there isn't an energy about taking care of the kids. It's a matter of making sure the woman has to go through the pregnancy. That's the revealed preference. The other main point I hear along these lines of logic is that the fact that there can be exceptions to abortion laws in terms of cases of rape, like if you're actually viewing a life as a life and pregnancy as a pregnancy, so that like the unborn child is still a child, and you have no right to kill it. Oh, unless it was conceived in the wrong kinds of conditions. That doesn't actually make any sense. Now, I don't know how true it is that there are exceptions. I didn't check this out. All information is crud, so be careful. But I want to point out something in terms of this reasoning process. The basic reason for putting forward this kind of argument on the part of the left, as far as I can tell when I feel into the energetics behind it, what they're saying is their morals are wrong and need to be destroyed. Even if the pro-lifers don't recognize the wrongness of their views. What that means is we need to impose the fact that they are morally wrong on them against their will until they agree. Maybe we need to re-educate their kids. Like this is pretty directly about memicide. It's not blatantly stated, but it is something saying their culture is wrong and needs to be completely obliterated because it is horrendously morally wrong, because it imposes on women's bodies. So this is not to dismiss that argument. I'm pointing out something about the structure of it. There's something equivalent on the other side, looking and saying this. So there are two variations on this. So there's, on the one hand, if the pro-life side is in fact actually just trying, like, not just consciously, but actually all the way down, are saying, no, these children have a right to live. If that's actually what's going on, they have a right to, like, it makes sense to object where you can, rather than saying, look, you can't require us. It is unfair to require us to push for an entire economic and legal transformation of everything all at once in order to be able to object to this one example of murder. Yeah, Gina's saying to me, the only argument is whether we all have sovereignty over our persons or not. Yeah, I think that is core to the issue. And part of the problem we're running into is how do we account for the sovereignty of the unborn? And at what point do we want to view that? Like, should men masturbating be considered a problem? Should women menstruating be considered a problem? Like, there's a meaningful question here that is not really being grappled with. I agree that is the principle that I adhere to as well. For me, there's an actual unknown that I don't know what the same kind of thing is. Because there's a real question that we as a civilization have not, or even just the United States has not even started to grapple with, as far as I can tell. It's mostly been screaming about which view is correct, rather than noticing there's a complexity that we haven't really held on to. But I want to highlight that, suppose that the left's view of the right, or the pro-choice side's view of the pro-life side is actually just accurate. What they actually care about is punishing women for having sex. Okay, and that's the actual thing. The question is why? What is the actual reason for that drive? It's very fast to come up with arguments if you've been soaked in the pro-choice argumentation structure. Quick way to dismiss it, in order to say, look, that whole attitude needs to be destroyed. We need full memicide of this thing. But if you actually slow down and you track, look, there's a cause. The cause is going to be tied to something. Have you looked? Right, and I could do the other side as well. It's just that I tend mostly, like most of the people who I talk to tend to be left-leaning. So this is the side that makes the sense to emphasize right now. I could flip the narrative around. William mentions, because sexuality needs to be foreign and corrupting, Christianity depends on that. Yeah, this is especially strong in the Calvinist threads that took over the United States. There's something about purity being related to sexual purity and the need to distance from the physical body. There's a lot there. But the fact is that there's going to be some reason. And if you override that reason with physical force, you are actually intensifying the trauma that is at the core of what's going on there. It might be, in fact, what's at the bottom is some version of generations of I was spanked or beaten. and this is a pattern that is continued. So a person is, I was hurt as a little kid, and now when I'm grown up, the way that I deal with that hurt is that I fight for this cause, because there's just hurt at the bottom. The thing that needs orienting to there is not hurting the person more for daring to have a reaction. It's looking at what is the support that is needed. And until that happens, you can't actually know if maybe there's something real that they are tracking that is really important. As a quick example along these lines, I have I have seen a lot of sexually free cultures in the various leftist cities that I've been in. And basically all of them fuel enormous drama explosions almost every time I've seen or heard about them. Like polyamory is a thing that keeps showing up, is like, okay, some occasionally you find somebody who can work out a polyamorous situation where everybody has multiple partners and it's a love cluster or something like that. But it ends up fueling a lot of problems that they have a hard time orienting to. This is not to say that marriage is totally stable, high divorce rates and so on. This is like it's complex. Human relationships are complex, but there's something that it seems to me is plausibly being protected there about saying, hey, if you follow all sexual impulses without bound, this actually cracks something in culture that isn't being accounted for because the logic makes sense. So, but we don't know what the problem is. So all we can do is name, look, there's something to account for. There might be something real there. We don't know. Because one side is screaming about this entire edifice, saying, of course, the whole thing is true and praise Jesus. And the other side is screaming, no, of course, the whole thing is false because free love and fuck you. There isn't a conversation happening. See, Jean says that because our DNA says to reduce the competition for the men, so those women must be stopped from their promiscuity. Yeah, there's a whole line of thinking along these lines, sort of evolutionary psychology that that produces ideas like hypergamy that don't fully they do a good job of explaining the experiences of people who have a lot of sexual difficulty, but they seem to have a much harder time explaining the places where culture actually seems smooth and low drama. So I think that there is some truth to that, and I see the logic of it, and admittedly I don't know what the problem with the logic is, but it seems like there's something a little more complex going on. I don't know exactly what it is. So it's like I agree-ish, and I also have this question mark. Brandon adds, I would say the positive root of the desire is to protect women and protect meaningful bonds between people. Yeah. Now, I could emphasize the same thing in the other direction of looking at, okay, if you're pro-life and you're listening to these pro-choice people, there's a piece about bodily sovereignty that is a meaningful question that is not being really addressed. And the question of, well, why do these people have such a casual attitude towards murder? Can you not condemn it and instead look at it and say, what's actually going on? I could emphasize that side just the same way. There's a way to listen to the entire argument, both sides, with deep compassion and notice whatever is going on is complex and nuanced and is important to listen to if you're going to bring any kind of energy that can offer a sort of resolution. And the reason I mention this, like, this is not something that you have any control over, that I have any control over on a scale of even one other person, let alone the whole argument. Like, that's just beyond my power scale. But by having this kind of orientation where I notice whatever is going on has causes, there are no villains. The answer cannot be memicide, because that answer is symmetric. Both sides will try for it. And leaning in that direction increases the heat and intensity of the memetic war. So if I can recognize those are true, then when those narratives try to possess me, I can see through them as nonsense. It doesn't make any sense for me to really believe in, bodily autonomy for women, that's the ultimate thing. If I feel fired up about a specific position, where did the fire come from? Whom am I dehumanizing? That doesn't mean there can't be fire, but if the fire has any hint of dehumanization or memicide, memicide is more subtle. It takes a while to learn how to detect memicide, but the impulse to memicide. But if you can learn to feel these things, you can notice when there is something trying to possess you. That, for me, is the value I get from tracking these things. I become more capable of compassion for myself and for the people I am connected with. I become more capable of listening to perspectives that I don't agree with at first, and notice, oh, there was a bit of a memetic structure that wiggled its way into my mind, possibly when I was a little kid, possibly more recently. And now I can hear something a little different and notice, oh, like I was raised basically pro-choice. And my default leaning is pro-choice. But I notice that there's something complex that I don't understand about, well, do I think it would be okay to abort the child like a week before their birth? Obviously not. A month before their birth? No. What about like, so like, where's this line coming from? Oh, because I heard the line of 3 months before is like, but where did I get that? Oh, I just heard that. I don't actually understand, because I know something about the development of consciousness within the womb. I know a few things about this. I've observed it. I've traced the memetic structures in people and the energetic structures in people, including myself, from some of these effects. So, but obviously it seems like menstruation seems fine, I think. Like if I decided it's not fine, what would that even mean? So there are real questions here for me where I look at it and I go, oh, I'm carrying around chunks of rigid beliefs that don't actually form a coherent picture. And I have a big block of unknown here. Just like the unknowns around sexuality, around like, well, multiple partners, like sex outside of marriage. I've decided it's not for me. Like I want a partner, a life partner, and I want to be her life partner. Like that's what I've become very clear about. But that's because I've experimented and I've explored, and now I have a sense of, oh, for me, this is actually important, and I can now see how it's important. So, but the ability to come to that unknown is from a willingness to listen with compassion and to notice where I have been invited to possession, or I've been invited to be possessed. It comes from noticing, oh, when I actually look at the structure of these memetic battles, they have a structure. And if compassion were the thing that were defining the entire context, the conversation would be going very differently. So how can I be kind to myself? And by that, I end up being kinder to the people that I'm in contact with. That, I think, really matters on an individual scale. And it tips, like, to the extent that people get that they get personal benefit by leaning in this kind of direction, which is a true fact. It's like the clearer you see this, the more obvious it becomes. To the extent that that becomes something that you shift into because it's good for you, the more that people recognize this, the more it becomes possible to have a sane, kind civilization. That seems to me like it actually has the potential to resolve these difficulties. Not protesting. That's not going to do anything. There's been a little bit of conversation. Scroll up. That was the main thing I wanted to say. So William says, you don't want to follow impulses in an unexamined way, e.g. you might want to require people take STD tests before getting involved, or you might also not want to have babies with your mother. Just going to say that because this is 2022. Yeah, hypergamy is kind of lonely beta copium, in my opinion. Yeah. An important element here is how much of this actually needs to be in law. What is the actual role of law in a sane, kind civilization? I'm going to talk about this difference of what are you responsible for versus what can you be aware of and understand, but you're not responsible for. The purpose of that distinction first is to reclaim sanity so that you know, look, you don't have to decide about any of that. You don't need an opinion. It doesn't matter what I think about abortion because my opinion is not going to change anything. That gives me a lot of freedom because it means I can wonder. I'm not morally responsible for coming up with the right answer. It doesn't matter. What I'm responsible for is deciding what is true for me, what is relevant for me. If I can make that clear, then the understanding I can have at a large scale of what is the role of law at a civilizational level for a sane, kind, conscious civilization. If the human race were an entity that were sane and kind, how would it use law internally? I don't know, but I do know that it can't be based on threat and blame in order to micromanage how people do little nuances of concepts of morality. That can't work. I can see game theoretically why. There's a clarity to this. It's almost a theorem. Would it make sense to ban people from having sex with their mom? I don't think it matters. Do you want to ban people talking about hypergamy? I don't think so. But you do need to encourage people to develop memetic literacy. That seems obvious to me. Does it need to be a law? I don't think so. It seems like you don't need a law against incest. Most people don't want to. It's viscerally disgusting. And the occasions are sort of where there are exceptions are usually sort of self-correcting. So yeah, so there's a lot of complexity in this space. I'm going to keep bringing up these questions, these topics. William adds, replying to Brandon's comment about the positive root of the desire to protect women, etc. William replies, the meaning needs to be more than sex. You want to have an intellectual bond ideally, or at least I do. Yep. Although there's a question of where do these wants come from? Like maybe it comes from someplace deep and you're tracking that. It's just important to notice that a lot of the things that we want because they are memetic structures that have been handed to us, rather than because we are clearly seeing the distinction between the memetic structures that pass through us and surround us versus what is true of our own personal desires. It takes a lot of work to sort that out, and I'm still working it out for me because it takes a lot of weeding. So that confusion is another version of the confusion I was describing before between what's your responsibility and what's not your responsibility. And then William adds, to be clear, by bond, I don't really mean glue, more like rapid fire reciprocation, ease of communication, becoming almost an extension of each other. Yeah, there's a way for that to organically arise. At some point I may describe the emergent nature of when you lean in the direction of supporting the context, the evolutionary context of the species of egregore that is pro-human and pro-clarity, pro-truth. This naturally results in interpersonal connections that are immensely rich and kind, but it arises organically. There's a very specific game theoretic structure to it that is, I think, beautiful. I may talk about at some point in one of these. Hopping around. All right, and Jean adds, all in the domain of the person who is responsible for the potential child. Yeah, there is, and then it says it's very simple. Yeah, there's a question of what is the, how to say this? What does the word and concept responsible do at a cultural level? Individuals are only able to respond at their own scale. So when we're using words like responsible, in the culture, for the most part, we mean it's sort of threat-based or blame-based. Like who is to blame if something goes wrong here, or if something isn't cared for? So if a child starves to death, then you blame the parents for not adequately taking their true responsibility for the child. it's unclear when you, it turns out that blame-based cultures reliably will produce the kind of memetic distortions that I've been talking about systematically. That you need to remove blame and replace it with a different kind of social organic structure for truth to be safe at a cultural level to speak. So when you do that kind of move, what exactly are we talking about when we're referring to responsibility? That's its whole own conversation. But I do think that there is something that rounds very closely to what you're saying. That a lot of the things about how does a when you track what the actual relationship is between a parent and a child, and the parent is in their power and is clear about their own capacity to hold their own traumas and to digest their own, and to do their own inner work, there's something immensely clear about what it means for the parent to be responsible for the child, and that all of the details about, well, how does this account for in utero, and how does this account for the process of getting pregnant in the first place, these things naturally arise and tend to get resolved. I haven't thought through all of the details of each of those pieces, but they do tend to naturally just fall out. There's a question of, well, what about the parents who aren't accepting, aren't acknowledging their own responsibility to process their own trauma? The ones who, for instance, are having kids because they're lonely and they want someone as a companion, or they just want to have the identity of being a mom or a dad or whatever, and then they're using the kid in order to bolster their own identity. This transmits a kind of psychological and emotional abuse to the child. We don't talk very much about that, but it's a meaningful concern. What that means is the to-be parents, or the actual parents, are in fact regressing to a childlike age. And so orienting to them is the same question. A sane civilization orienting to such parents would have the same relationship as a sane parent orienting to, particularly, say, a foster child. It's more obvious in the case of the traumatized foster child. A parent who actually takes priority for their own inner work and knows how to take care of themselves and hold themselves, and is able to be present with the child. There's an interaction there that is the same. It's like it's a fractal version of the same structure. But that requires us having, at a civilizational level, an awareness of this kind of trauma processing, not just knowledge, but embodied. So, and before then, what do? That's complicated. And I don't know the best answer. Like, how should a bunch of toddlers parent each other? Give some of them guns? That's currently our solution. So yeah, but on that, I suspect this is a somewhat long-winded way of describing maybe a different angle on something that I think is compatible with what you're saying, Gene, I think. And if it's obviously not, then feel free to correct me. I'll be sure to mention it. William adds, personally, I would think of fetal viability if the fetus were born preemie as a guideline. Yeah, I think the truth is going to be more complicated than that. That's my clear gut sense, but it seems like a thing worth accounting for, one of the pieces in the calculus. But I think it's popping around. Brandon says, I think one of the hardest things about this issue is that you have to face and take responsibility for a difficult situation. Either you are killing something that either is a life or is close to being one, or you are facing the responsibility of someone else's life being dependent on you for decades. Either way, you face a hard situation in life that you are responsible for. Yeah. Yeah, I think fully honoring the challenge of that, the difficulty of it, is part of what we are called to do, called to orient to. Jean says, a man has a big responsibility. It is where he plants his seed. Yeah, I agree. I think I just agree. And then there's also some things about how culture has oriented to that responsibility and how it hasn't really accounted for the full scope of what that means. And and has not been honoring that. Um, uh, and then Gene also adds funny, Michael. I'm not quite sure what was funny, but I'm glad you found it funny. William responds to Gene's comment about the man has a big responsibility, saying, yes, but there is also a lot of non-reproductive sex out there, and there would be anyway. It's just not a modern, it's not just a modern phenomenon. Yeah, something funny about, so I'm sniffing. That's an old memetic fight. Be a little careful there. A little careful there. That's starting to step into some Groundhog's Day territory. Just be cautious about the next few moments if you find your body getting riled up. Let's see. Brandon says, having grandparents around in the family probably helps children hopefully see a more full spectrum of self-work and maturation that goes beyond just the stage of their own parents, making more space for parents to not be perfect. Yep, that would be great. Current cultural environment actively attacks the ability for us to do that, but oh, I see. I'll mention that in a second. Yeah, there's, and then William adds to Brandon's comment, it really ought to take a village. Yeah, we just don't know how to do this right now, but something like that seems really important. It seems to me that we've got to go in some kind of direction of this kind of memetic literacy and maturation, emotional maturation, and learning how to hold our own inner children, so to speak, by which I don't mean something psychically cool, although you can take it that way if you want, but I mean this in the sense of when we're traumatized, which can be very minor. I mean, even micro traumas in a sense. There's you end up with an emotional pocket of how you were at the age in which you experienced this. And so people are walking around with pockets of emotionally stuck at a certain developmental stage, and those are often driving everything. So the question of how to orient inwardly so that we choose to hold our own inner children and to parent them, but to have them go through the process of dissolving this and orienting to it. And so yeah, it's messy, and yeah, I agree with both of you. It would be great if we could do that, but remains to be seen how that works. And Gene clarifies the guns comment. So you mean like, how do a bunch of toddlers govern each other? I guess give some of them guns. That's what you found funny. Yeah. And Jean responds to herself and tags William saying out there. And I'm not quite sure what you're mentioning there, but that's your own guys' conversation. Okay. So I should know better than to ever expect I'm going to take less than an hour. I was actually wondering because I wasn't sure that I had a lot to say, because frankly, a lot of these things about abortion, I haven't done a lot of deep diving into, because I'm looking at the larger memetic structures, and a lot of the details of the information around the abortion debate is immensely saturated in propaganda, and it's mostly irrelevant for my life as it currently is. So it's just not something I'm as informed about as a lot of the arts of history and other contexts. But I'm glad we got a chance to explore this stuff. I see this conversation is going on. William saying, William suggesting to Jean, suggesting sex at dawn. Okay. I'm not sure whether Jean is responding to me saying I have, as in you have dived pretty deeply into this stuff, or if you're responding to William saying you have already looked at sex at dawn. But in any case, yeah. Thank you everyone for listening and for engaging. I find I really like getting to engage with people in this kind of way and getting to explore and to respond and interact about these kinds of topics. Are you responding to me? Okay, cool. Yeah, I got that impression, Jean, from your Facebook comment where you'd mentioned this is something that's been alive for you. I forget exactly what you said, but I got the feeling that this is something you've dug quite deeply into before. So I'm coming from some pretty general principles here. So I hope that I have I hope that I have done justice to this stuff. And if it turns out that there's some area in which what I have said, like I'm stating the principles as I see, what I see clearly, and I'm trying to highlight this is a part I don't see clearly over here. If you see that there's some place where I obviously am way off my rocker and you can show me why, I am in fact quite willing to listen. I am absolutely zero interested in arguing. I'm not here to debate. I'm here to look at the truth. So if you see some place where you can point me in a direction that's like, hey, this is a piece that you have been meaningfully missing. Like, I'm not trying to educate myself about all of this stuff right now. It's not the center of my attention. But if you see that I am meaningfully off, like if at the level of resolution I'm able to see and the things that I've talked about, you can look at that and go, I think your opinion would be pretty different, at least at this part, if you looked at this. Cool. Then I'm happy to receive that. Very happy to receive that. I see Brandon saying, I think you did a great navigating a topic like this. You did great navigating a topic like this. Thank you. Okay, so with that, I will close this here. Thank you so much for being here. And I will be back on next week with whatever arises by then and see what kind of adventure the world holds for like how things will explode. And Jude says, thank you, Michael. You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for your contributions.